to the next episode of the Cannabis Review. I'm delighted to be joined on this episode by Professor Daniel Baer. Daniel is a professor and a PhD and MSc in Social Policy from the London School of Economics. How are you keeping today, Daniel?
I'm doing pretty well.
Excellent. I'm delighted to have you on, a man of many skills and talents. I think you're going to be a perfect person to have this discussion that we're going to have today. So do you maybe want to give everybody a quick little overview of how you ended up in the cannabis space and how it became a kind of a point of contention for you?
Sure, yeah. I began using cannabis medically in 1998 when I was 16 years old. I had been really seriously injured and I was dealing with some serious facial injuries, some traumatic brain injuries, some post-traumatic stress disorder, but I couldn't talk to anybody about it. And I began seeing the sort of racist patterns of drugs enforcement that were going on in my Los Angeles high school and neighborhood, and just wanted to better understand it. This thing that was helping me was supposedly really super harmful and bad, and I had never heard otherwise. And so I started digging into it. And, I think drugs policy in general and cannabis in particular, it's a rabbit hole that you can just kind of always keep going down. So I did work with medical cannabis patients at the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana. I worked with the American Civil Liberties Union for several years doing drugs policy, civil rights work, and then came to the UK to go to the London School of Economics, where I looked at how the Met Police enforce drugs law on the streets and how that sort of fits in with day-to-day policing activities. And now my work focuses a bit more on the engaging people in discussions about cannabis and how we promote public education and public health around cannabis in a way that is, different than the paradigms of old, where I'm not sure if DARE was in Ireland, but the DARE program, Drug Abuse Resistance Education, which came about under Ronald Reagan in the US, was sort of what I was educated under. And it was drugs are bad, people who use drugs are bad, and everything about drugs is bad. And in fact, I remember a DARE police officer coming to my school and telling me that you can overdose and die on marijuana in the same way that you can with heroin. And I was like, oh shit, like this is really bad. And we're trying to change that because I think there are some potential small risks associated with cannabis. But there's also a lot of benefit that can come from cannabis that people potentially miss out on without good drugs education. And so if we can promote harm reduction to deal with those minimal and small potential risks, and also ensure people have better experiences with cannabis, then I think that that's something worthwhile doing. And so that's what I'm doing now. And I really enjoy that work because I think back to what I could have used when I was younger, and I'm trying to maybe fill that gap.
Yeah, no, understand. I think the difference between the illicit market and the regular market cannabis is worlds apart. And I think a lot of the stigma comes from some of the toxic substances that might have been put into some of the street products. That's where the kind of negative connotations come from. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about is cannabis policy. You've seen a number of different industries around there, a number of different nationalities around the world enact cannabis policy. What do you think are the two things that people are getting right and the two things that people get wrong when cannabis policy has been drawn
up? That's a great question. I'll start with the two things I think they're getting wrong. And I think, at least what I saw with Mr. Trudeau here in Canada, was that cannabis legalization was something that came about, but cannabis was still feared by the government. And so if you look at the way the legalization came forward, I think they were trying to protect their right flank against conservative attacks. And so, for example, if you supply cannabis to someone in Canada who's a minor, you face something like up to 10 years in jail. Actually, I think it was 14. It's a very high number. Whereas if you supply a minor with alcohol, it's potentially like a $500 fine. And so they really wanted to say, look, we're legalizing cannabis, but we're still tough on cannabis. We're still, it's not because we like cannabis that we're doing this. And I think that undermined a lot of the process there. I think if you're going to say prohibition is wrong, we haven't been getting this right for a century, you can't legalize but still claim that you want to be tough on cannabis. I think you need to try and have your rhetoric match the legal status of it. And I think the other aspect of it, which is problematic, was that the legalization, at least in Canada, didn't do a great job of bringing forward the legacy market, bringing the legacy market into the legal market, and undoing some of the harms of prohibition. Just because we've moved to legalization doesn't mean that we've undone the harms of a century of prohibition. And if you don't acknowledge all of the harm that was caused by prohibition, then you leave the remnants of it sitting there, and the people who are harmed no better off, because we've seen that the people who were working in cannabis when it was illegal aren't necessarily the ones profiting now that it is legal. And I think that there's a bit of a problem there. In terms of what people have gotten right, I think in Canada, and I think hopefully we'll start seeing this other places, I think ensuring a wide variety of products available for people that are strictly regulated and tested to ensure that people are getting the product that they deserve, and the product that is claimed to be sold to them. We want to make sure that one of the benefits of legalization is that, you mentioned potential adulterants and chemicals. I think about it more in terms of like paraquat and other pesticides that can be on illicit grows, but also just in terms of the environmental impact that illicit grows can have. I know, I come from California, and illicit grows in the mountains can be very detrimental to the local ecology. So I think, ensuring that things are well regulated, that the environmental impact is minimized where possible. I think those are really great aspects of legalization. And the other thing that I would say about legalization, something that they got right, at least here in Canada and most of Canada, is not having an artificially high age for consumption. In Canada, the minimum age is 18 according to the federal rules. Provinces can change that. So for an example, in Ontario, they've aligned it with the alcohol age, which is 19. Quebec has gone to 21 for some reason. I think that's a bad call. But we know that people start consuming cannabis usually somewhere between 16 and 18 years old. Their cannabis use is highest until the age of about 24, and then it tends to peter out a bit. And I think it's really vital that we engage new cannabis consumers in the legal market, not because we want their dollars in the legal market, so much as we want their practices to be supported by harm reduction practices and to be able to engage in public health and public education opportunities that you get inside retail stores and in legal pathways. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge that young people around 18, 19, 20 are consuming cannabis. And I think it's problematic that the US has stuck with 21 as their initial age for consumption.
Yeah, well, that kind of brings me on to the next topic, which is the narrative of cannabis. Would you agree with the statement that a lot of this kind of kickback is because what Americans would call Republicans, and what most people would call conservative people, are pretty much the ones enacting legislation and kind of have got into the positions of power to be able to stop or progress something, and the fear within that element of society, they're less informed on the topic, so therefore I think the fear is higher for them, hence some of the little stringent ages of 21 or no edibles over 10 milligrams and all some sort of the nonsense laws that seem to get enacted. Is that a case, or do you see the narrative of cannabis on the Democratic side just as bad as the conservative side?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's just as bad. I think part of the issue is that even people on more the left-leaning political side still sort of are indoctrinated in a century of prohibition and the language and the rhetoric and the fears. And so even, supposed liberals like Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, yeah, Joe Biden's a bit of a different category there, but I think even people on the left are hesitant because they still have a lot of ingrained fear about cannabis, even if they previously consumed. But I think there's also a fear of public backlash and sort of, as I mentioned with Mr. Trudeau, protecting that right flank. And, Bill Clinton famously, like he was a liberal, well, at least according to American definitions, but still enacted, very harsh welfare reforms, increased punitiveness around drugs issues. And so I think a lot of times it's the fear of conservative political ideas as opposed to conservatives themselves changing the legislation. That's been one of the most disappointing aspects of, for example, Barack Obama's presidency so far with Mr. Biden. Although I do suspect with Mr. Biden, we'll see the Democrats move some cannabis legislation soon in the Senate while they still at least retain that 50-50 balance. But I think the narrative around cannabis is based on fear and stigmatizing, and so many people who have opportunities and who even might think that it's the right thing to do to change cannabis laws get held up because they don't want to be seen as that guy or that woman supporting cannabis. And I'd say, you know what, I'm really proud that Mr. Trudeau pushed forward legalization in Canada. He did it for a very specific political reason, which was it brought out the youth vote, and it was key to his victory to get young people out and voting. And in his initial electoral victory, they came out in huge numbers in a way that they hadn't previously, and a lot of that's attributed to cannabis. So he had a political reason to do it, and I think a bit of the will to do it as well. And I'm glad that that happened.
And can you tell us a little bit more about your misinformation campaign that you guys are fighting in the college that you work out? Maybe highlight that a little bit to the audience.
For sure, yeah. So we launched the Weed Out Misinformation campaign, and we, as I said, I thought back to sort of like, well, what information did I need when I was a young person? And I'm turning 40 soon, and so I realized my voice is not the right voice necessarily to connect with young cannabis consumers. So what we did is we surveyed 1,600 Canadian cannabis consumers, and then we held focus groups with them to identify where they get information about cannabis, who they trust to deliver information about cannabis, what information they want about cannabis. And then we took that and we gave it to advertising students at Humber College. And we had them build out some campaign ideas. And we took those campaign ideas back to cannabis consumers, to bud tenders, to public health experts, so that we had a campaign that was built on data from young people, that the materials were built by young people, and then so that the campaign would resonate more, and actually have a sort of a human-centered design approach where we took the needs of cannabis consumers as the basis for what we would be building. And the idea is to dispel these old myths, because when you don't have opportunities to actually learn about a drug and how you can use it safely and to achieve the things you want to achieve with your cannabis consumption, there's a lot of room for problematic information to sort of enter the community. And we want to start dispelling those myths, in part to reduce some of the potential risks of cannabis, which there are some. They're not great, they're far less than alcohol, but they exist. And we can address them by giving people good information built, based on the information they want and need, as they've told us. And we can also then ensure benefit maximization to say, here's how to have the best experience with cannabis possible. And I felt like that just didn't exist in the right form, and didn't exist in a way that was targeted both at consumers in general, but also targeted to be rolled out in retail stores. So we've got a lot of materials that are designed to support bud tenders when they have people in store who might say, listen, I'm really new to cannabis. What do I need to know? We've got a checklist that says, here's your first time or sort of infrequent consumer checklist that you can think about. So what is the set and setting that you're consuming cannabis in? What is your goal with getting high? Because not everybody has the same goal. Some people want to get really baked and sit on the couch and veg out. Some people want to get a little bit high and go garden. Some people want to get a moderate amount of high and do different things, right? Everybody has different goals, and all of those goals are worthwhile, right? They're all how people want to consume and enjoy cannabis. And we want to make sure that people understand how to get to that place with their goals around cannabis consumption, and do so in a way that is safe and effective for what they want out of the experience.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree with you more. It seems to be a great campaign, and I hope we can check back in and check up on that out in the next couple of months and see how everything's going. Maybe share some of the information with the European audience over here. The last topic I just wanted to jump on, and I'm just going to break it down into one simple thing that you think challenges facing cannabis legalization. So over in Europe, a lot of movement is happening at the moment. What is the one big major challenge? I'm sure there's a myriad of different things you can discuss, but from taxation to licensing to social equity, what is the number one thing that you think legalization challenges?
Are you thinking legal, like getting legalization to happen, or biggest challenge once legalization has happened?
Getting legalization to happen. Sorry, excuse me if I'm not clear.
Yeah, no, that's such a tough question, because we look at the different models that have happened. If you look at the U.S. states, those tend to be really driven by social movements led by cannabis consumers. I think about Prop 64 in Colorado, which was the voter initiative to legalize cannabis, and how that was pushed forward by a really strong concerted movement that had been building for decades and decades of cannabis consumers and cannabis policy advocates. But then you look at Canada, where it was sort of a, there was that movement, but in the end, I think it was much more of a political decision as opposed to a weight of the voters really signaling their intention that prohibition needs to end. I mean, I think for me, thinking about the biggest sort of, if I think about it, impediment to getting legalization to happen, it's an old guard of politicians who are very concerned about keeping their jobs, and I think afraid of cannabis, and don't realize the number of people who consume cannabis or who have consumed cannabis and done so without any problems, without any detriment to their lives, and in fact can often reflect if it's past cannabis use or current, and say, actually, yeah, this has enhanced my life in some way. And I think that the biggest challenge to legalization is getting those voices heard. And so I know there's been some campaigns. I remember the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML, in the US many years ago had a Smoke the Vote campaign. And the idea was that cannabis consumers needed to come out and say, I consume cannabis, I enjoy it. And so there's, to even do that, we need to break down some of the stigma so that people feel comfortable. And then once they feel comfortable, do we get the voices out there so the politicians realize there is a voting bloc that cares and that can be swayed if you say, actually, yeah, we're going to consider cannabis legalization and figure out how to do it in our specific national context. I think just getting through to those people and making them realize that there is a viable population, and also the sky isn't going to fall. Getting them to be, I guess my point would be getting them to be not afraid of cannabis, because frankly, what we've seen in Canada is not really increased usage rates in any significant way. There's been no increase in, like fatal car crashes. We've seen a bit of an uptick in emergency room visits, but frankly, I think the data would suggest that that's more about people being willing to go for medical treatment if they've had a bit too many edibles or something, and not that they are having more problems. So I think it's just sort of old politicians who are afraid of cannabis, and once we can maybe vote them out or move past them or get them to see the light, then maybe we will. I think about Joe Biden in this regard is bit of an old school guy, was a drug warrior, now seems a bit open to it, even if he's a bit hesitant. And I'm hopeful that maybe he reads the political writing on the wall and it's just like, yeah, actually, maybe this is something that we can support, or at least not get in the way of, at least at a federal level in the US. Yeah.
It's a great answer. I think the old politicians that are in there, that are entrenched in there, I think are the ones that need to be educated and informed the most to get this policy changed. It's been great talking to you, Daniel. I could talk to you all day about policy. Hopefully, again, we'll touch base towards the end of the year and see how your program's going and how everything's turned around over in Europe here.
Awesome. Thanks, Owen.
In the next episode.